The Canadian Human Rights Commission has thrown out our racial discrimination case against the CBC. Here are 4 takeaways from the decision. The official stylistic policy of the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation instructs all of their staff to capitalize the word Black when referring to Black people, Asian when referring to Asian people, Indigenous when referring to Indigenous people, but to not capitalize the word White when referring to white people. This policy is a degrading insult which establishes a racial hierarchy in the minds of the public and denigrates people who identify as white, as well as people who are identified by others as white. In our ongoing efforts to have this policy changed, so far we have had a lengthy exchange with Blair Shuchuk, who is the standards editor of the CBC. We have contacted the Canadian Radio and Television Commission. We have filed and obtained a Freedom of Information request regarding the CBC's internal communications about this policy. We have compiled a petition which currently has over 1,600 signatures, which we strongly encourage you to sign, by the way. You can pause the video right now. The link is in the description. It only takes a second and you can sign anonymously. And most recently, we filed a racial discrimination complaint against the CBC through the Canadian Human Rights Commission. The remedy we sought through that case was for the CBC to apply some form of a racially neutral policy that treats all groups equally, such as uppercasing everyone or lowercasing everyone. That complaint has now been dismissed, which means that it's been tossed out of court. The Commission chose to dismiss our complaint on the grounds of being trivial, as defined by Section 41 of the Canadian Human Rights Act. In this video, I'll be providing a summary of that decision. As I'm about to demonstrate, the comments made in this case by both the CBC and the Commissioner herself are consistent with the thesis that both of these institutions operate in a manner which discriminates against white people. We're currently selecting which next steps to take towards having this policy changed, but however we proceed, the facts of this case will serve as building blocks towards that end, whether that comes in the form of addressing the CBC directly or through the longer-term objective of reforming our human rights system. Here are 4 takeaways from the decision on our racial discrimination case against the CBC. Takeaway number 1. The CBC explicitly argued that our complaint should be dismissed because we're white and that white people are not protected by Canadian human rights law. The CBC argued that the complainant in the present matter identifies as white, which, as per the above authorities, is not a characteristic that attracts the protection of human rights legislation, including that of the Act. The CBC submits that, on this basis alone, the complaint must be dismissed. So what the CBC is saying here is exactly what it sounds like they're saying. They're saying that white people are not protected by human rights law and that our complaint should be dismissed because we're white. This statement is so unbelievable that I wouldn't blame you if you didn't believe it. I wouldn't have believed it myself if I hadn't read it with my own eyes. If you're skeptical, you can find the original document on our website, swciv.com, where you can read this statement in its full context. In their attempt to support this outrageous position, the CBC cited 2 precedents, a 2013 case before the Nova Scotia Human Rights Tribunal and a 2020 case before the British Columbia Human Rights Tribunal. If you want a more in-depth analysis of how those precedents relate to the CBC's argument that white people are not protected by human rights law, you can see the write-up which we've posted on our website. For the purpose of this video, however, I simply want for you to consider what it says about the culture of our legal system that a lawyer wouldn't be totally embarrassed to even attempt to defend this position, or would make an argument like this without fear of some kind of reprimand or disciplinary response. I think the wording of the Law Society of Ontario is instructive here. The Law Society is the oversight body which disciplines lawyers who conduct themselves in a manner which brings the legal profession or the administration of justice into disrepute. The perspective that the CBC's lawyers are expressing here absolutely brings the legal profession and the administration of justice into disrepute, in that it is a perspective which falls exactly in line with and thereby reinforces the perspective of white nationalist terrorists who would totally agree that white people are not protected by human rights legislation and that therefore there is no point for white people to even attempt to address their concerns through the legal process. Those individuals would point to this statement by the CBC as an affirmation of their worldview. Now, my opinion might not carry as much weight as that of the CBC's lawyers because I'm not a lawyer myself, but for what it's worth, I do study a lot of Canadian law for the purpose of activism, and I think that the CBC's position here is a totally incorrect misrepresentation of the facts. You and your family and your children and your friends and white people generally absolutely are protected as white people by Canadian human rights law just as much as any other racial group. And the position that's been taken here is absurd and legally indefensible. Using the legal system is a slow and boring process, but it is otherwise an entirely viable and effective avenue for white people to peacefully address our concerns and achieve our desired results. I would say, however, that comments like this are valid ground for concern insofar as they reflect the culture of our legal system. Uncovering and identifying these attitudes is part of the process. By launching this suit and creating the circumstances which elicited these comments, we now have evidence to build a case for reforming the system, which was part of our contingency plan all along. We can't reform the system if we don't have evidence of corruption, and we can't uncover evidence of corruption if we don't test the system and give it opportunities to either prove or disprove itself. And there is yet more evidence to come. Here's takeaway number 2. The judge of our case uncritically followed the CBC's lead in mischaracterizing the grounds of our complaint. So check this out. The Canadian Human Rights Act protects Canadians from discrimination on the basis of 13 different characteristics. 3 of those characteristics are race, color, and ethnic or national origin. Of those characteristics, in my opinion, the CBC's policy discriminates against white people primarily on the basis of race. I would say, however, that the policy also discriminates on the basis of color and ethnic or national origin. And so when we filed our complaint, we checked off all 3 boxes, race, color, and ethnic or national origin. Here's a screenshot of that complaint. But now check this out. In its argument for why our complaint should be dismissed, the CBC ignored the race-based component, and they ignored the ethnic or national origin component, and they addressed our complaint as if it was based only on the grounds of color-based discrimination. As the CBC's lawyers wrote, the complainant alleges that the CBC's journalistic decision to capitalize black but leave white lowercase is discriminatory on the protected characteristic of color. So that's kind of weird. That mischaracterization could have been from sloppiness, or it could have been part of a deliberate strategy. It's not the job of the CBC's lawyers to be objective. It's their job to be partisan advocates for their client. However, the judge of the case is expected to be objective. And that's what's significant here, is that the judge simply followed the CBC's lead and also mischaracterized our complaint as discrimination on the basis only of color. She began her opinion as follows. The complainant filed a complaint with the Commission on September 17, 2020, alleging discrimination on the basis of color with respect to the provision of a service against the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. It's significant that the judge mischaracterized our complaint in the same way as the CBC, because it shows that she failed to give our complaint its fair and proper consideration, and because it appears that she was simply following the CBC's lead. Here's takeaway number 3. In her attempt to justify the policy, the judge appealed to mysterious and unnamed grammar rules which probably don't exist. Okay, now getting into the actual decision made by the judge of the case. The judges of the Canadian Human Rights Commission are called commissioners, and the commissioner in our case was Deputy Chief Commissioner Genevieve Chabot. In the defining statement of her decision, Commissioner Chabot wrote the following. The respondent's policy does not single out or target the complainant for adverse treatment. Rather, the policy speaks to grammatical rules as they apply to the words used to refer to a racial group. There is no support, apart from the complainant's personal opinion, for the proposition that these grammar rules adversely differentiate the complainant from others. So, what grammar rules do you think Commissioner Chabot is referring to here? Is she referring to the rule which says that the names of racial groups are proper nouns and that proper nouns should always be capitalized? Well, the CBC doesn't follow that rule, does it? Is Commissioner Chabot referring to some other grammar rule which says that the names of racial groups, for some reason, should not be capitalized? Well, if such a rule exists, the CBC doesn't follow that rule either, does it? So what's going on here? How could Commissioner Chabot dismiss our complaint by appealing to grammar rules as they apply to racial groups, without reconciling the fact that, no matter how you slice it, the CBC's policy does not accord with those rules? Is there some other grammar principle out there that I've missed? Because it serves as the fundamental building block of her principal argument, you'd think that Commissioner Chabot would just tell us what the grammar rule is that she's referring to. But she doesn't do that, and so we're forced to guess. And allow me to suggest that the reason why she doesn't identify this mysterious grammar rule is because It doesn't exist. There is no grammar principle which dictates capitalizing the names of some racial groups but not others. Commissioner Chabot is just making stuff up in a desperate attempt to defend an indefensible policy. Here's the final takeaway, takeaway number 4. Commissioner Chabot ignored significant components of our argument. So as I quoted a moment ago from the defining statement of her decision, Commissioner Chabot wrote that there is no support apart from the complainant's personal opinion for the proposition that these grammar rules adversely differentiate the complainant from others. So like I said at the beginning of the video, we have a petition which currently has over 1,600 signatures, which was presented to Commissioner Chabot. We also presented the results of our Freedom of Information request, which found that over 70% of the CBC's audience is opposed to this policy. We also supported our position with a battery of articles and commentary from bipartisan news and opinion outlets, as well as cultural references which demonstrate that lowercase lettering is used to intentionally demean and show disrespect. We also cited over half a dozen articles from psychology journals detailing the effects that imposed collective shame can have on group self-esteem. Commissioner Chabot didn't address that evidence by saying something to the effect that all of that evidence is not convincing, or it's not admissible, or anything like that. She simply acted as if it didn't exist, which is essentially a lie. We provided tons of support for our position. She just pretended that we didn't. So, in conclusion, our complaint was dismissed without a full trial on the grounds of being trivial, which means that in the opinion of Commissioner Chabot, hearing our complaint would trivialize the purpose of the Canadian Human Rights Act. Trivial in this context means to take away the significance of the act or to make the act worth less than it should be. Is our complaint trivial? Absolutely not. Our complaint is exactly in line with the purpose of the human rights system. What trivializes and undermines the legitimacy of the Human Rights Act is behavior like we saw from the Commissioner herself and the lawyers of the opposing party, claiming that white people's human rights are not protected, failing to properly read our complaint, dismissing our complaint on the basis of nonsensical arguments, and ignoring our evidence. In terms of next steps, because it was dismissed before it could start, this is the first time we've seen one of our cases come to some kind of a conclusion. Our racial discrimination suit against Facebook, which was accepted by the Ontario Human Rights Commission, has been moving forward since we launched in May of 2019. Our hate speech case against CBC still hasn't even had a chance to fully initiate because courts aren't operating in full capacity because of COVID. And we also have other cases which we're working on, which we haven't publicly announced yet, but those have not yet come to a conclusion either. Because this is the first time we've seen this, we've now discovered that if we want to appeal the decision, it could end up costing us upwards of $8,000, which is not an insignificant amount to us. If you're interested in helping us cover the costs of our work, you can find our donation page at swciv.com/donate. At the moment, we're in the process of filing a request for an extension on the appeal date. Regardless of how we proceed, signing that petition is one of the most effective things you can do to help us, as it will be one of our most powerful instruments in this ongoing effort, whether it continues through the courts or through some other means. The link to the petition is in the description. And that's all for now. Thanks for listening.